Hey, welcome back to the FlexDiet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On this podcast, we talk about all things to increase performance, add muscle, improve body composition, and do it in a flexible framework, all without destroying your health. And on the podcast today, we've got a deep dive into the analysis of body composition. So if you want to get a better body composition, one of the big questions is, how is the best way to measure it? So today we're talking all about DEXA scans and body composition in general with two experts in the field, Dr. Grant Tinsley, who's published a lot of work in this area and is focused exclusively on body comp plus some other cool projects, and the one and only Dr. Eric Helms. And if you notice a little bit more background noise in these intros and outros, it's because I'm recording this from the car. Don't worry, my wife Jody is driving right now. We are on our way to the Silverback Summit in Austin, Texas, which we're recording this as Thursday morning. This podcast will probably go out the following week, so by the time you hear this, the conference will be over, but super excited to see everyone there. It'll be super fun. And if you want more information from me and you want to hear about all the updates from conferences and research and much more, go to miketnelson.com/podcast. You can see all the podcast episodes and also hop onto the free exclusive newsletter. Just scroll down below. You'll be able to get onto the newsletter for free, and I send you all sorts of great stuff directly into your inbox. As I mentioned on the podcast today, super excited to have Grant Tinsley and Dr. Eric Helms. And we have a great discussion all about body composition and primarily looking at DEXA scans. But one of the issues is that most people would assume that a DEXA scan is 100% accurate. Everybody, when they think about it, knows that's not true. But I've lost track of how many people I've had to talk off the ledge with looking at two DEXA scans that were done even by the same facility and the same DEXA scanner, but done only maybe 4 to 6 weeks apart, and seeing different readings, or people doing follow-ups and being confused because they thought they're making progress. Now it looks like they're not. So we have a great discussion with the two experts in that field. So enjoy this podcast, Dr. Grant Tinsley, Dr. Eric Helms. Oof. Thank you guys for being here. Really appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to this discussion on body composition. So welcome to the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us. Yeah,
thank you so much. I guess the main question that I get all the time, and I know you guys have done actual published research on this too, but when I was doing my PhD, I had the opportunity to obviously have access to body comp equipment. So I got in my head that I'm like, I wonder how many different ways I could measure body comp within a week. And so I was able to get a DEXA, I did underwater weighing, I did a bod pod, I did a BIA with the expensive, like several $1,000 thing with the little things you put on the skin. I had two people do skin calipers, and I think that was it. And I had some real cheap methods I used, but they were horrible. So I got all the data back, and just looking at it, it was crazy. And I tried to keep nutrition the same and hold other variables as best I could, but it wasn't perfect. So I still trained during that time and water, everything else. But it went from anywhere being, no, his body comp's okay, to he's a fat bastard. And of course, it's different equipment, different days, different times. But I was quite shocked at the range, and I can't remember the exact numbers right now, but it was many 5 to 7% in body fat, not percentage of air, like in body fat percentage. And that was shocking to me. So I'm just curious. I know you guys have done some N of 1 experiments too, and we'll get into more kind of detail what the actual research says off of that, because I think the general premise, people in fitness know that body comp will vary. And I knew that, but looking at the numbers, I'm like, oh man, if somebody just came in and only did just pod, or they just did underwater weighing, or some of the better methods, it was more different than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, man. I have my first experience in published research. The first time I conducted a study was for my master's when I first got here. And I specifically looked at this crossover trial where we had pretty well-trained people, mixture of physique athletes, strength athletes, some combat athletes, and then just some real serious exercisers who went through 2 different interventions, just 2 weeks of either moderately high or high protein diet on a pretty severe caloric deficit. But the really interesting thing that we did, this is my first time really having exposure to high quality anthropometry. And I was really excited about that. I got introduced to what is ISAC, which is not that common in the United States, but it's very common in Europe and Australasia. Anyway, it stands for the International Society of Sports Kinanthropometrists. And anyway, to get certified on it, you have to do a total of, there's 4 levels. And level 4, like you're like the skinfold god or goddess. But even just for the first level, you have to have a technical error of measurement. I think it's something like 2.5% per site or something like that.
Damn, that's pretty good.
So, yeah, and so that scales with how large is the measurement on each site. So when you're getting a reasonably lean person, like in using this in the sports setting, it essentially translates to having less than 0.5 millimeter error on each one of the sites. And you do 2 measurements, and if they're within that error, you're good. You have a spreadsheet that automatically calculates it. The third one, if you're over that amount, you have to take the third, and then you take the median, and then you add up your sum of 8. And when I got exposed to this concept, and because I wasn't certified yet, I did get it later. A good colleague of mine, Ruth Naidu, she did the anthropometry for this study. And I'm looking at the numbers like, wow, like their sum of 8, because I think she was level 2. You'd have on average like a 4 millimeter like actual error. So if you brought the same person back in 2 days in a row, they didn't change their diet, didn't change their nutrition, nothing. It might be 60 on one day, 64 on the next, or as low as 56. So anything more than the change across 8 sites is a real change. And that's something that you could use regularly. But what blew my mind, Mike, was that what most people do, because of 8-site skinfold, means nothing to them, is they want a body fat percentage.
Yeah.
Right.
How shredded am I, bro?
Yeah. I got to put this in my email signatures. Right.
Yeah.
So, so then we plug it in, and I used to demonstrate it because it blew my mind, just like it did for you that first time. I used 3 different equations, all quote unquote validated. And the means of this trained male sample in those 3 different equations, one was 10%, one was 20%, one was 15%.
Holy crap.
Same
That's just from the
skinfold
equation
measurements.
difference, correct?
Correct. So one was a 7-site, one was a 4-site, one was a 3-site. And I don't think any of them were more precise either than the others. And it just goes to show you that there are a lot of assumptions baked into this. And that there's the memes where it's like the small brain, the bigger brain, the lit up large brain, and then like the God brain. The first step is, percentages or skin folds are trash. And the next one is, hold on. And eventually you get to, wait, raw skin folds are actually more reliable. And actually some data, like if you look at a paper that came out of Gary Slater's lab, has less error than DEXA. And so there's so many levels to understanding this. Obviously, skin folds can't tell you the same things that DEXA can.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you your lean body mass from that, obviously. But that was my first kind of introduction into the space where I started to realize that testing body composition was a whole complex kettle of fish. And yeah, ever since then, I've been intrigued. And as a coach, you have to figure out, and I think this is underappreciated, good coaches understand that they need to be able to diagnose real changes, but they don't necessarily know how exactly to do that. And that's something that's built into good science. So anyway, I'll leave it there, but I had a very similar experience.
Do you do any crazy measurements, Grant, since you have access to lots of very cool, fancy equipment?
Yeah, since we're talking origin stories and the interest of body composition methodology, mine was actually kind of a little bit of a weird one. When I was a PhD student at Baylor, I was conducting research related to resistance training adaptations and intermittent fasting. So we would be using body composition assessments, particularly DEXA, and a little bit of bioimpedance. But while I was conducting these studies, I was interested in the technologies, how to use them in the best way possible. But it was actually when I was volunteering over in the sports nutrition department in athletics, when one of the female athletes was coming in and she was about to get her DEXA scan. And she asked me a question. She said, if I ate a meal containing a lot of fat before my DEXA, would it look like I have more fat? And I thought, I'm like, that's actually an interesting question. So just from that question, I started looking into the literature on, say, pre-assessment food intake and standardization. And around that time, a really interesting study had come out where they essentially carb loaded individuals for several days and saw that they could artificially increase lean mass. Now, there was some debate, including a letter to the editor back and forth. The initial description was ambiguous about whether this was this final DEXA where they saw the artificially increased lean mass due to glycogen loading, because it was over a very short 3-day period of time. There was some ambiguity on if this was in the fasted state or the non-fasted state. But in the response to the letter to the editor, the author said it was fasted, that 3 days of glycogen loading, even when someone was fasted the next morning, that they saw this. So I ended up conducting some work in that area just out of interest, because I'm like, oh, this is really, again, interesting to me. So we did some studies where we provided the diet to individuals in a crossover study in a very high carb condition and a very low carb condition. And we ultimately saw errors due to food consumption. So if someone is not fasted, if they came in the afternoon, for example, we saw artificially increased lean mass. But after an overnight fast, that resolved and there was no difference. So anyway, that just off the cuff question that may have seemed silly at first glance actually got me interested in this area of methodology and standardization. And that's been one of the large areas of my lab's research since then. So that was my origin story into getting deep into the weeds here.
And on a similar note on that, while we're talking about glycogen loading, on an individual level, I would, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would assume that you would get an error, right? So let's say you've got dude bro 69 that goes in completely fasted and glycogen depleted, right? They do some horrendous thing. They get glycogen relatively low. They come in fasted. They do their DEXA. They go away. They, let's say, hyperglycogen load for 3 days, come back in fasted the next day. Wouldn't those two measurements be potentially different? And wouldn't the DEXA read that as lean body mass, or does that just all fall out in the wash because of how the measurements are done, or some of the error calculations or other things in the DEXA itself?
No, you're absolutely correct. And there have been even shorter term studies where they've showed this, where they scan individuals, they get them off the table, essentially have them chug a bunch of water.
Yeah, water. I saw that one.
Back
yeah.
on. Yeah. And they see that it appears almost exclusively as lean mass. Now, of course, this is context specific, what the magnitude is. If you're trying to trick it that way, where you're trying to really deplete, really reload, especially if you're not going to do fasted assessments, you can certainly trick the DEXA, so to speak. In general, there's been studies where they track people, they have a standardized assessment in the morning and then track them throughout the day as they've had 1 meal, 2 meals, 3 meals, and so on. And the artificial increase is pretty directly proportional to the overall volume of food and fluid that's been ingested, with some of that being retained throughout the day. So the overnight fast does a good job in the context of, say, a lack of extreme dietary manipulation. But certainly if you're trying to do something intentional, knowingly or not, or if you're hitting different points where someone would reasonably be glycogen depleted, have different, say, tissue hydration status as compared to another time point, even a short amount of time later, then yeah, you could absolutely see the type of error you're describing.
Yeah, because a buddy of mine who had access to a DEXA in a different country, I won't say his name, but it wasn't either one of you guys. He had a DEXA done in a glycogen depleted state, and then he was a pretty large mammal, and so he glycogen loaded himself. His body weight went up by, I think, 6 pounds, and the DEXA reflected that he magically gained 6 pounds of lean body mass. But yeah, based on what we just talked about, that would make sense. And again, this is an artificial state, right? Because one of the things I always think about is how much can you manipulate it on purpose, and then you have back to, okay, now if we want to see, like Eric was saying, a true change in what's actually going on, then it gets us back to what are some of the best protocols and things to do, because the clients are going to want to know, hey, I did all this work, I paid for this trainer and I sweat my ass off. Did I really get any leaner or not?
Yeah. There's this convergence between two factors, right? There's biological variance that is unrelated to actual change. And then there's the technical error of measurement. And you need to have an appreciation, which is what you do with reliability studies, of what encapsulates both. And you can do that on a group level in research, but to understand that on an individual level is what you need to do in the real world. And I don't think people necessarily appreciate just how much acute things can change other things. You guys were talking about carb loading, and I've done deep dives on like the science of peak week, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a study that came out that blew my mind. When you start digging into some of the old physiological research, like the sports science that came out in the 90s and 80s, we realize a lot of our foundational things we just say that we take at face value are sitting on like studies of 6 people. And this is not to throw our whole field under the bus, but it's just to show the progression, and that sometimes we do need to go back and question things. So for example, we all know that there are 2 to 3 grams of water bound with every stored of gram of glycogen, right? But when you actually dig into that research, it's a little flimsy. And there was this really interesting 2015 study that came out where they did this glycogen depleting protocol with cyclists, and also in the heat, so they got dehydrated. And then afterwards, I think it's by Fernandez Elias, 2015, really good study. And afterwards, they either gave them just like a glucose syrup, or a glucose syrup plus a ton of water. And they found that like the minimum amount of glycogen that can be stored is like 2 to 3 grams. But in the group that got a whole bunch of hydration, they were storing like 15, 17 grams of glycogen bound, of water with every gram of glycogen bound in the muscle. So what does that get picked up as? And so the interaction, not even just hydration status or glycogen, but the interaction between the two. And then think about what that visually looks like and the things we see as bodybuilding coaches. So I think people underappreciate the necessity of doing controlled conditions. And fortunately, you and I, Mike, are sitting on a call here with a man who definitely appreciates controlled conditions. And I've actually been through those controlled conditions. And
that's what I've heard rumors of this.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's a good segue, but I think that's
perfect segue.
Just an example of talking like that's biological variation you can get in hours just from the interaction between exercise, hydration, and carbohydrate intake, which is only a few things you can manipulate. So
yeah, and I'll turn it over to Grant here in a second, but so one of the things related to body comp was similarly that just scared the crap out of me, because as you do your PhDs, you have to do your compositions. You can actually officially be a PhD candidate at that point. And I remember studying for mine, and they can basically just ask you whatever they want, basically. And I had to do body comp assessments using BodPod for an energy drink study we were doing. It was more or less just to baseline people. We weren't looking at body comp changes, but just to describe what the group was we were working with. And I remember looking at the data on underwater weighing and going, okay, what if they start asking me, you run these horror stories through your head, or at least I did. What if they start asking me about, BodPod versus underwater weighing and the mechanisms, and what about the data from underwater weighing? And so I had this 3-day thing where I went down a rabbit hole of like where all the data from underwater weighing came from. And I was horrified. And you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the residual lung volumes was still unpublished, I think, or at least the chart we were using at that time, which was scary. And I think the original data was from like 3 or 4 cadavers or something like that. It was a very small number that all these kind of things had been extrapolated from. And anyone who's ever done that measurement, right? You stick you in this huge pool of water, you have this fancy scale, but you realize real fast, if you've ever done a lot of those tests, is that the rate limiter for most people is how much air can you get out of your lungs when your head's underwater? And to stick your head underwater and to get all the air, quote unquote, out of your lungs as you can is not an easy thing for people to do. It's extremely foreign to do, because your reflex is to hold your breath underwater. And you realize we had some people, I was running 5, 6, 7 trials. We're doing this for a lab. And one of the students is, they keep getting leaner. And I'm like, yeah, they're just getting more residual volume out of their lungs each time. But at some point, you have to be like, well, you're not going to leave you here all day to do 15 trials of this. So you have what is like practical, what is reality, and like all these things that go into the measurement that we just take for granted that, underwater weighing is one of the gold standards. And that has, like you're talking about glycogen, all sorts of issues that wrapped up in it at the same time too.
Yeah, no, great points. I'll mention, just we don't need to go on this tangent, but for the many people who have been victims of underwater weighing, there was a paper I was able to collaborate on with Jeff Tesh, was really the one who was the kind of leader of this project, but it was validating underwater weighing with your head above water. So you're essentially submerged up to the jaw, and it had a lot about like head volumes and calculations and corrections, but ultimately came out to be a relatively valid method. I know it's not used as much anymore, particularly because of bod pod being a related technique that's quite a bit more enjoyable for the participants, but just wanted to mention it in case someone's listening and is doing underwater weighing, that there are some options that would at least get you past that unpleasantness of being completely underwater and trying to get that stable weight.
Very cool. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And so what do you want to add to this conversation, Grant? I'll leave it open-ended on purpose because I know you've done a ton of this work in this area.
Yeah. First, I just reiterate, Eric made a great point about technical and biological errors. Ideally, if someone is certainly a researcher and even a coach, maybe who's assessing clients and has some equipment, what you would really want to know is both those components. So your technical error you could get from kind of immediate test, retest assessment. So say on DEXA, you scan someone on DEXA, you have them get off, you reposition them completely, scan them again, do this for a group of ideally 10 people minimum. And you can calculate some of these metrics to see what that technical error is. The ideal thing to do would be to also bring them in 24 hours later, say following the same overnight fasting protocol, trying to standardize all these factors, and then assess them again. And from that, day to day, you can get an estimate not only of the technical error, but added to it some biological error, because their body is presenting in a slightly different state, even though you try to standardize everything. Our lab's done some of that. One of my PhD students is working on finishing analyzing and writing that up now. And Gary Slater's lab, which has been mentioned on this call already, has done some great work in that area as well, just teasing this out because it differs for different methods. There are some methods like bioimpedance, for example, that have incredibly high, for many of the techniques, incredibly high retest reliability, where they look just absolutely fantastic. But if someone comes in 24 hours later, a lot of things can happen in their body that will introduce a lot of biological error to the assessments. Other techniques that are less reliant, say, on those internal components, DEXA, including as an imaging technique, but certainly things like 3D scanning or anthropometry, they might not be quite as susceptible to some of those same biological errors. So just certainly lots of interesting points there if you are assessing, because of course, when we're actually assessing a change, it's always going to be on a different day. So the immediate retest reliability will always make a method look better than it actually is when you're assessing it as someone one day and then a separate day, typically weeks or months later.
Yeah, that's great. And do you find that the baseline for DEXA is normally pretty good? And the second part is, does it vary per machine? Because one of the, I guess, the criticisms I've heard of DEXA is that the companies don't really necessarily tell you everything that's going on. Everyone seems to claim that their DEXA is the best DEXA, but if you notice difference, you don't have to mention any names. They don't want to get you in trouble, lose funding, but from different companies, because I think to the outside consumer, they're like, I don't know, the DEXA is a DEXA.
No, you're absolutely right. Similar to other methods, but this certainly applies to DEXA.
Those apply to all methods. I'm just picking on DEXA.
Yes, you certainly want the same device, the same software over time. If you are, for example, DEXA, sometimes we'll be in a scenario where we're updating something and they're trying to upgrade our software. In those cases, I really want to know, okay, tell me what's being updated. Is this just making the software prettier? Are you actually changing anything in the algorithms? Because that's essential to know. This is another reason for good reporting in research manuscripts, not just, we use the GE Lunar Prodigy, but the software version, how you adjusted the different regions, all those components. So there's some variability between different manufacturers, even between different models that are the same make, maybe same software, slight idiosyncrasies between the devices. So I'm certainly an advocate both for research setting and practice, if you have the ability to do this, for collecting your own reliability data. You might find published data on the same device, the same software, but there might be minor things that those individuals were doing differently than you in terms of what they had the participants do for standardization, how they positioned them, how they analyzed it, and just different machines. Even if it's supposed to be the same, not everyone will be completely identical in every feature. So I think it's certainly a good case, something to look for ideally in research if there's in-lab reliability data. As a reviewer, I'm often asking for that. And I understand it's a little bit of a pain to collect, but ideally, if you have your own reliability data and that's the same device you're assessing people on, it just increases your confidence more than pulling a citation from someone else's lab and saying on average, the precision error of DEXA is 1.5% or 2%. So that's what we're going to assume ours is also. Because as you mentioned, varies based on manufacturer and a number of other factors.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you want to know, like Eric was saying, are we actually measuring a real change, right? Because you can get a number that to an outside person looks like a real change, but if your error bars, right, your error of what you can actually measure as quote unquote real are pretty wide, then it's, I guess we did this study. I don't know if it's any different or not.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think there are a lot of parallels to like how we'd interpret statistical significance, for example. Instead of this dichotomous, like this was significant, this wasn't, I view errors as a spectrum because there are a ton of different metrics out there. If you're looking at the precision of a device, it's like, how high is your standard? There's some that just roughly would be based on something like 1 standard deviation of error versus 2 standard deviation errors or more. So if you have just like very high standards, you might have such a large error, even on a good device, that you would need an enormous change in body composition where like the person would have known long before this that they had changed their body comp. So to me, it's a level of confidence. It's like, how sure are you? So we might get a precision error that's based on just, again, roughly analogous to 1 standard deviation of error. And if we exceed that, I'm like, okay, that's a good sign. Maybe we haven't exceeded this really high standard of something we call least significant change, but we've exceeded some level of error. So I'm a little more confident this could be real. Not as confident as if you just have this enormous change that exceeded every error metric we have. But again, I view it as a spectrum. Now, if you have that tiny change where it's, did you go from 16.1 to 15.9% body fat over these 8 weeks or 12 weeks, so low that it's smaller than even our tightest devices with the lowest errors would still have errors higher than that. So we would not interpret that confidently at all.
Yeah, in my book, I give an example of, I want to say, if you're using a body fat measurement that has a 3 or 4% error rate. So it could be plus or minus 3 or 4 or whatever it is. And then I did just a random number generator to take the mean. And I just showed them, and I did this for legit. And I was like, all right, here's someone who decided to get DEXA, we'll say, with this 3 or 4% error, maybe a commercial one, not like Grant's badass, like we're gonna make sure in your really good condition situation. But you're going into one of these mobile DEXA units, which have become very popular in Australia, and you're getting tested every week, right? And there were times where oh man, you were crushing it on this diet. Other times, and then what I did was like, okay, and here's what's actually happening is they are in a 500 calorie deficit sustained, and we expect them to lose this amount of fat mass throughout this period. So here's actual, and then here's what you could get just rolling the dice with this error, with the amount of that you should have lost versus you would have lost. And I show how like first week, oh my God, you're crushing it, amazing. Then you hit this massive plateau. So then we go, okay, what would the person probably do in that scenario? They probably cut calories or increase cardio, yet they've been losing weight very consistently. And then I got this another massive change. Oh, that worked. And now all of a sudden you're expecting, and the thing you believe, and you hear people talk about their own personal anecdotes. So I normally hit a plateau after my initial month of dieting, then I got to cut real hard, and then I make great progress. And actually you needed to do literally nothing. And all you were doing was chasing ghosts. And you run into that a lot with people who overtest these things. And I think the assumption is the more access I have to high-tech lab stuff, the better. But the reality is that if you use one of these devices that has a smallest worthwhile change or least significant change that is greater than the expected change that you can experience in the time frame you're getting tested, it can very easily, and it's actually more probable than on an individual level, it will lead you astray and lead you to making adjustments that you otherwise wouldn't have. And it can get in your head because it can be contrary to what you're visually seeing or experiencing. So a lot of the times when I have an athlete I'm working with and they have access to something like this, it is me trying to talk them out of, the scientist, out of getting these, at least the same frequency or the specific type of testing that they think they should get. And this extends to a lot of things like testosterone tests. And okay, are we really going to do 3 serial tests? And are you going to do it first thing in the morning? Or are you going to try to do it after work one day and then on your lunch break on another? And then you actually don't want to get tested twice and you have this one value and compared to 3 years ago.
I got to train in the morning. I'll just measure it after I'm done training.
Perfect, because that won't have any impact, right?
That won't affect it.
Yeah, so between people wanting to get nutrient/blood tests and wanting to get body composition tests and then not knowing the difference, it's rough being out there as a coach because you don't want to tell them that like data is bad, but they really do need a lot of coaching up and just education on, if we're going to get these tests, how do we use them in a way that will actually be helpful to us, rather than potentially just like, I'll look at it and be like, I don't know anything more. In fact, I from your pictures and your training and how you're telling me you're feeling, I have more information, but now I have to deal with you being exposed to this frightening or overly encouraging piece of data, or perhaps accurate piece of data. I don't know.
Yeah.
And now I'm coaching that. So it's a can of worms that has to be done right, or it is not even just negligible. And I think some people take from this conversation like, oh, that's not useful, but it's actually actively harmful in many cases is what I want to get at, is getting bad data versus just data that, oh, I don't know. Because it's one thing to look at a published manuscript that's not you and a group of 10 people and be like, oh, okay, so we don't know when there's a real change. It's another thing to be able to say that to yourself, but then step on the device or step into the device or get the measurement and it to tell you, hey, yeah, you're 3 weeks out, but you're 17% body fat. Just to pick a random number, by the way.
Yeah, I've had to talk several people off the ledge of, and this has happened with my own clients, where one of them last year, everything was going great. He's, hey, I'm probably going to do my DEXA again. I'm like, yeah, cool, that's fine. It was, I think, 6 or 8 months apart. I'm like, okay, yeah, it should be good. And gets it back, and the numbers just, they were not even just a little bit variable. They were like not close at all. Unfortunately, he had to go to a different place. He had a different technician. And in that case, we finally figured out that they put in the wrong equation. The place that he went to wasn't used to testing athletes. And this guy was pretty lean. And so they had used the wrong equation. So I said, go back, have them use the other equation. And then it was at least reasonable, because it was so far out of the area where I knew something was wacky. But like you said, the harder ones are where you're not sure if it's really an outlier, if it's legit. It feels like it doesn't fit, but then you're trying to explain to the client of, maybe this is an error and look at all your other data. This doesn't match. You're hitting PRs. You look leaner, like your calories are down, your weight, and so that's the harder situation, because in their head, they're like, this is gold standard. This is a DEXA. And you're telling me the DEXA is wrong? I'm like, that's not necessarily wrong. There's variables, there's errors. And yeah, it's just a very hard conversation to something that at face value you would think would be more useful. And a lot of times I find if the frequency is too close, I just now, when I do a consulting call, if someone says, hey, yeah, I want to show you my DEXAs I've had every month for the last 4 months, I know it's going to be a shit show. And you feel bad for them, because they are actively doing something that they think is correct, and they want to know what it is so that they can make changes to what they're doing. So they have all the best intentions in the world. It's just a lot of times I think it just adds a ton of confusion to the mix.
Yeah, I agree. I'd say 2 things on there to make it less bad than it has to be. One would certainly be on the standardization. And I know it's hard if you're working with clients who have access to different facilities. In that case, going to a different scanner, as you found out, had a very large effect. There are some DEXA softwares where you can literally check a box and it will change the body fat percentage by 5%, because it's whether or not it applies this correction factor. But yeah, as standardized as everything can be. And then I think everything ideally would be given as a range. If you aren't able to get your own reliability data, if it's a mobile DEXA or something, you can look up several sources and be like, okay, this is the percentage. We're going to say plus or minus 3% based on several trials, or 2.5% or what have you. And then when that 15% comes back, be like, okay, it says 15. This really could be 13 to 17. You were 16 last time we assessed. So we're not super confident there's a change here. So take this with a grain of salt. And similarly to some of what you guys are saying, where you're having to deal with that, I often get asked about body composition assessments for athletic programs or individuals. And even though I love body composition, and this was one of my main areas of research, I feel like I'm often de-emphasizing one, the need for testing, and then also de-emphasizing the importance of that piece of information and trying to put in that context of performance in the gym, subjective feelings, other things that they might be monitoring closely if they know what they've done with their nutrition, all these factors. So I think it can be useful in some contexts, but it is hard when you have access to a good device and it spits out and it looks so precise. It's 17.
And it looks pretty. It gives me pretty pictures.
2%. Yeah. Pretty pictures, all of that. So yeah, it's certainly a challenge.
Going back to my interest in bodybuilding peak week. So I've got my student Kai Homer, who's going to be submitting his master's pretty soon. And what he did was he had this case series, which is going to be a crossover trial when we go to fully publish, but just for the purposes of his master's, it's 4 different people who are either competitive physique athletes or people who are in that kind of condition, who specifically dieted for the study, and then they did either a carb load condition or a no carb load condition, and then did a pump up or no pump up. And then we also got pictures of them doing bodybuilding poses, ultrasound, as well as skin folds. And we have the reliability data, of course, on the skin folds and the ultrasound. And then those pictures where we actually black out the face, send them to bodybuilding judges and have them rate which one looks better. And I could be wrong, but my guess is going to be that the human eye of a bodybuilding judge, I don't know about the reliability of it. That's something we would, that's harder to test. But I think it's probably more precise, and you can see things but I think an untrained person, like it's going to differ person to person, but I think an untrained eye, maybe not, but for a trained eye and like a bodybuilding judge, I think they can pick up on things that are not going to get picked up by anthropometry. And what I really would like to see in the future is like a scalar comparison of like, all right, if we see this many millimeter change in a skin fold measurement or centimeter change in a muscle thickness, what does that visually correspond to? Because all of the time, people are not actually trying to get to X% body fat. They're trying to look a certain way. And we don't have the ability to relate those two things. People can do it with measurements. If you go, I got a 30-inch waist. Okay, oh, you got a tiny waist, right? I got 20-inch arms. Oh, you're huge, right? So I think it would be nice to be able to have a more visual understanding of what are these changes, and understanding what does a real change look like. When does it meet the threshold for a visual assessor to be able to pick up on it? And it'd even be cool just to be like, all right, we took 100 bodybuilding fans and we showed them your before and after pictures, and how many of them noticed the change, and how did that pick? Because this is ultimately something, typically we don't think this way in objective science, because who cares? People think that's subjectivity is bullshit. This is why we do p-values and measurements. But ultimately that's what
your whole sports graded on that.
Exactly. Right. So you should know that. And ultimately I think, like, I've done a lot of ultrasound data, but I don't know what is like, all right, so you had a 10% increase in your biceps ultrasound. Can I tell? I don't know. Like, that's just not something that we think about.
Yeah, and even that comes into the bias of the person if they were their coach. So I don't work with a ton of physique athletes, but I do with a handful once in a while. And one of the things I do is, as it gets closer to their show date, and even closer, 8, 16 weeks out, whatever, I take their pictures and send them to people like yourself who are not biased and will give me honest opinion. One, I don't know if I trust myself at that point. Like, I know what I'm looking at, but yet I don't have a ton of experience. And 2, I always wonder about what is my intrinsic bias, because I know how hard this person has been working to do it. And you can see big changes, but am I going to miss small things because I want them to be successful and I know how hard they've worked and how miserable they've been? And then 3rd is just having a non-biased person to be like, hey, I sent it to these people. I don't tell them who they are. Here's their feedback. And does the feedback match up? Right. So I sent it to 3 different people. All 3 people, did they say the same thing? Did they say something a little bit different? I don't know. That's just something I've done because I'm always also curious in the process. And if they all line up, cool. Then we know what to do, and I'm out of the picture, so they can't be mad at me.
No, it's an interesting one for sure. And I think, case studies are often not something that we look at as the same quality of evidence as group-based trials, which they're not if we're trying to inform your average best practice for someone who lands in the bell curve of response or distribution of whatever variable we're talking about in humans. But I think doing case studies is a very good experience for someone in sports science, because your default is, all right, I ran a comparison to trials. My power calculation was I needed 10 or more in each group, because that's what my advisor told me. And 10 is 2 digits, so that's better. And then I ran an ANOVA. I don't know what that means. I just know that that's what I'm supposed to do. I can do it in SPSS, it's black box. But when you do a case study, and that's acceptable, right? Like that first example, like that's fine. And if the p-value is less than 0.05, then there's a decent chance that whatever happened in that group was significantly more than that group. But when you have to do a case study, how do you convince there's no standard deviation? What do I do? You know? And you have to come up with creative designs. You have to get outside of your little typical standard way of doing analysis that you haven't done differently in 15 years, or is an example of some of the old school folks in our field. And then you got to go, okay, how do I show a real change? So for example, I did, and we're writing this up, I stretched my calf in a stretching orthosis for 12 weeks, both calves. So instead of being able to just compare to my other calf, which would have been the easy thing, I'm not going to do that. I want both my calves to grow. So we had to come up with a design that allowed me to stretch both calves for 12 weeks. And then how do we compare that? So for 4 weeks of me just doing my resistance training with no stretching, we got a weekly, series of ultrasounds on my calves. And then we went, all right, so for this 4-week period, this is going to be the typical change. And we have to see something that is greater than some amount more than that. So we had to come up with a metric that described what is my typical variation, to then, all right, let's create a figure and look at the plot over the next 12 weeks to see at what point did I exceed that. And I think that type of thinking is really good because it encourages someone to actually assess, like, how do I know it's real? And that is basically the type of thinking that I think we're talking about here. And when you don't have, that's the biggest pitfall of body composition testing. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating area. And I think it's really intriguing when you look across methods and you're trying to figure out what's really going on, what's real, and what can influence these outcomes. And you can ignore what influences these outcomes so long as you're willing to accept that a real change might have to be friggin' massive and you can only get tested every 2 or 3 months. For example, 2019, I was fine with just getting my sum of 8 skin folds tested every month and not worrying too much about what was going on. I still did it Saturday morning, but like it wasn't a huge deal to me, like if my workout wasn't exactly the same on Friday, or the fact that I worked out on Friday and I came in on Saturday, so long as I kept doing that. I didn't try to control my exact water intake. I didn't do USG like Grant had me do to make sure that it was good to go at his lab. I just did my typical thing. It came in Saturday morning because I knew if over 4 weeks during contest prep, if I can't see a change, knowing that the technical error of measurement that my student who is doing anthro has, then I'm probably going too slow. So it's that type of calculus that I think you have to think about when you're looking at individual change. And I think rarely does that happen in the real world. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen consistently enough, even in the research world. But it absolutely does in well-done studies. And there are people leading the charge like Grant on that.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a good point. When anytime you're dealing with an individual, it's harder because when we have a group, there'll be some of these individuals, say such as Eric, who have some feature like their density of fat-free mass, something about them that's different than you would assume. But those people usually get canceled out by the people who are different the other direction. So if you have a decent method, enough people, and you standardize, that's why we can use quite a few of these methods in research. So if we're trying to see, did this dietary change work on average? Changing this resistance training variable, did it do anything on average? We can look at that. But yeah, when you have the one person you don't know, they might be that person who's just dead on the group average. If you'd done this as a whole study, they could be the extreme outlier in one direction, the extreme outlier in the other direction. So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, Eric, that you have to be creative in how you think about it in a case study. If you're conducting it for research or just your own self-research, working with a client, what have you, you do have to approach it differently because you don't have that advantage of other people canceling out some of that noise. And you don't know if that one person is the noise or if they're actually totally fine.
Yeah, even on peer reviews, if I don't have it, a lot of times I'll just ask for just give me the data on an XY axis with just an old school scatter plot. Like just put all the data on there with the two things you're comparing, because does it look like this? Does it look like this? Is there like 2 dudes up here, 1 dude down here? You can get an idea by looking at standard deviation, all that kind of stuff. But for me, there's just something about looking at it visually that gives me some idea. What you were saying is if there's 2 people way up here, most people here, I remember seeing this Stu Phelps data years ago on a hypertrophy study. Most of the people were in the middle, 2 people were way up here, and one poor bastard somehow lost lean mass during the study. right? And you're like, oh, that's interesting. And my brain is like, what are the two dudes up here? And what happened to that poor bastard down there? If you just looked at the pool of the data, because they had enough people in the middle, the data looked pretty good. Like you just look at the standard stats, you're like, that's amazing. It looks pretty good. But when you see it plotted, you get a different perspective. And like you guys were saying, it also prompts other questions of, okay, maybe there is something going on with those people. And what do you do at that point?
Yeah. And in a group-based study, there's even debate as to should you do anything about that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you got a sufficient sample, you would expect the sampling variance of people who, let's say, followed the protocol poorly and didn't grow would be equal between groups, right? You can do outlier analysis and you can do things like that, but ultimately you have a large sample because you need to control for the fact that people bounce around like that. And some could be hyper responders, some could be low responders, some could just be shitty at following the protocol. Some might have trained extra. It's actually even hard to determine what are the individual characteristics. Is someone actually a high or low responder? So this is cool, and it's a tangent. I won't spend much time on it because I know we got body comp stuff to talk about. But over at FAU, I'm an external committee member for Zach Robinson. He's doing his PhD under Dr. Mike Zerdos, and his PhD is all on like understanding individual response. And the protocol that we actually have to do is a within subject crossover. So your right leg does something, your left leg does something. So it controls for all those individual differences, right? Because they're both attached to the same stomach and heart and nervous system. And the crossover controls for the order effect, right? But then you have to do it twice, because something that people don't really appreciate is that what is the random amount of responsiveness you might get between two different things? Maybe your left leg or right leg just responded better to that protocol this time. We have to see if there's a difference doing it twice, right? So not only are it's like, again, that same kind of meme where it goes from small brain to lit up big brain. It's okay, crossover. Same person does two protocols. Oh, okay. Were they doing the same thing in both things? Okay, within subject. Okay, within subject crossover. And then the last one was like, oh shit, within subject crossover repeated twice. And then you realize that you're quadrupling the amount of time that it takes to run one subject through the study compared to a traditional parallel group design. So it's, oh, now I understand why we have all these kind of big picture group-based data, but we don't really have good data on what discriminates between the high responder and the low responder, because it is just a monumental mountain to climb logistically to actually figure out whether it is a real low or high responder. So
yeah, no, that's good. I appreciate that. And it's also good for people listening to realize that my pet peeve is people who've never published research telling researchers how they completely effed up their study. It's okay. Maybe you should just ask them, hey, why did you decide to do this? Because I can guarantee 99% of the time, like you were saying, there's usually a good reason, right? And then we can come up with studies that are theoretically amazing and have sound design, but if you can't get a single human subject to complete them, they're utterly worthless, right? So there's always these kind of trade-offs in the background that have to go on to get something actually published too. So I know, Grant, you got to check out in just a bit, but this might be a hard question to answer. But if someone is, let's say, a hypothetical, they're 15% right on body comp. Let's say we did MRI or we did some fancy other technique, and we know theoretically they're right on 15%. Could you speculate as to what percentage in a DEXA they may be plus or minus? So, for example, I'm guessing on this, but I'm guessing in terms of body fat percentage, like you're talking about before, I think they might be 2 to 3% higher. So on the high end, maybe they could be 18%. On the low end, maybe they could be 12%. Is there any sort of heuristic or framework or anything that people could use to wrap their head around it? Because I think people think that, oh, maybe 15%, oh, 15.5, maybe 14.5. But I think the variance could be higher than what most people are envisioning.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things here. One, I think at some point you could be in a situation where you're always chasing the better method. If you have DEXA, there might be, even though there is some error, like if you compared it to say higher model, like a 4-compartment model, if you could have whole body MRI, it would give you a little bit of different variables, but you could still get very good data from that. I think at some point you have to, I guess, accept that this may not be truth, but if this is a good enough method to help me track, if that's really what you're wanting to track, then you might have to accept it. Similar to what we were talking about before, you could have the person they're 15 on DEXA and you took them in and did whole body MRI, converted that to body fat percentage, you did 4-compartment model, and they're pretty dead on. They're all within 1%. Then you have other individuals who deviate widely. And this isn't random. This is due to different properties. Each method has certain assumptions. This is even more true. DEXA is a little bit better in this regard, but say something like bod pod or underwater weighing. Great examples where we're splitting all of body mass into fat mass and fat-free mass. But there's a lot going on in fat-free mass that differs between individuals, sometimes systematically in a group like resistance-trained individuals, but certainly at the individual level. You could have something where someone has a higher or lower overall density of their fat-free mass, and that will directly, from the calculations, directly influence, say, how high their body fat is, and because of that fat-free mass is on a device. So I don't know if I have a simple answer to that. It could be the method you have is spot on. We've seen this with $20 consumer BIA devices. There's some individuals where it is exactly the same as their 4-compartment model. This $20 device and that, and it's good for you. And most people don't know this, but good for you. Other people, it's 10+% different. And some of it could be random error, but a lot of it can be explained if you look into really the nitty gritty. If you're able to do all these assessments and look at the proportion of water and protein and mineral and things in their fat-free mass, that will often ultimately end up explaining why certain people tend to measure high on a particular method or low on a particular method. And we do have a great case study of this sitting right here with us on the call, just since we did this recently with Eric. He was one of those people that presented with some of these different characteristics. So for example, he had a lower bod pod body fat percentage than his multi-compartment model we did, not to the same extent as the other individual, Omar, who we were testing. He had more extreme deviations in his fat-free mass properties that caused him to measure much lower on bod pod rather than just a little bit lower. But then on bioimpedance, in contrast, Eric was incredibly lean, but was pulling some higher values up in the teens, one even in the high teens. That certainly isn't, I don't think, accurate. But when we looked into it and we saw his proportion of body water, it was lower than predicted, lower than assumed by these devices. So someone could look at it and just say, oh, these devices are junk, or this is all random. But when we looked at it, there were actually reasonable physiological explanations just based on Eric being a unique individual, his fat-free mass characteristics. He was doing intentional things with his diet then and is now, I know, as well. So a lot of factors going into it, but we were able to actually tease out why that happened. So again, most people don't have access to that information where they can say, oh yeah, I know the reason why I measure high on my home body fat scale. It's not only because it's not the best device, but also because I differ from what's expected in these ways. But just know, if you're an individual listening to this, you could differ in those ways. So it is possible if you're pulling a weird result, there may be a real reason for it beyond just the device itself.
Awesome. I know you got to head out, but last thing, if people are looking to do DEXA or some other measurements, any words of wisdom that they should at least be aware of?
Yeah, a lot would be reiterating things we've talked about. The frequency does matter. There are some who advocate, including the International Olympic Committee ad hoc working group on body composition. I think they advocate for no more than 4 assessments per year for a technique like DEXA. Now, certainly we have Eric over here prepping for his competitions. I imagine he might be interested in some variables between skin folds, circumferences, weight, other things that might be tracked a lot more frequently. But for some of these lab grade methods, partially because of the cost, the availability, all these things, I think the situation you were describing, Mike, where someone's doing monthly DEXAs, I think it really is too frequent in almost all contexts. You could probably come up with a scenario where maybe it would be justified. Again, if someone is doing like their aggressive prep protocol, maybe, and very tight standardization to the extent they can, maybe you could make a case for like monthly testing. But yeah, so I consider the frequency of testing, what's reasonable, whatever method you use, try to get the highest quality data you can by standardizing everything you can about yourself, just being as anal as possible. because we don't know what we don't know. There's some variables we know will influence this. If we chug a bunch of water before a test, we know that will mess up a lot of them. But just everything you can in terms of like your training or rest from training, dietary patterns, all of these things, the more you can standardize, the more you increase the chance that that value, you've controlled some of this biological error in it, and that value is a little higher quality. And then again, interpreting with a grain of salt, conceptualizing, even if you don't have the exact reliability data, conceptualizing this as a range. Hopefully you could find some information, even if you're not able to get your own reliability data from a coach, from the published research, just giving you an idea. It's okay, I'm getting this DEXA, but I should interpret this as plus or minus 2.5%. And that can help people. It's in some ways frustrating, but in other ways it's helpful. It's okay, I saw this small uptick in body fat that doesn't really match with everything else I'm seeing, how I feel like I look, how my clothes are fitting, what have you. And it can give you some confidence saying, okay, I know that's within the error of device. So that's something I'll take into account. So yeah, high quality of data and interpreting with caution would be my two big picture points there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so I have a personal website. It's just my name, granttinsley.com. It has information about our research lab and links to social media. I do share research primarily on Instagram, and my handle there is just Grant_Tinsley_PhD. So I'd be happy to connect there. And yeah, it was great chatting with you both. Sorry to have to jump off here a few minutes early.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much. We'll see you.
Absolutely.
I appreciate all your time. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Take care, Grant.
Thank you. Any other practical body composition words of wisdom?
Yeah, I think some of the things that I would recommend to people is just to remember why they're getting tested. You're not actually trying to go for a body fat percentage. You're trying to go for a specific look in almost all cases. And a litmus test that I will sometimes ask my clients is, all right, when they're giving me pushback or they really want to have a body fat percentage, I said, all right, let's say you're pre-test before we've even done a diet. Let's say your goal is 10% body fat, and on your pre-test, it comes out as 10%. Are we going to pursue the diet? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay. See, you don't actually care what the number is. You care about what is associated with that number. And I think that's getting the kind of the foot in the crack of the door. But most people, they have a much better schema of what is a body fat percentage. They associate it with something, right? So I would encourage people to get different associations. If you can get high quality circumference measurements or skin folds, those are accessible to everybody. They're not super expensive. You can get the self-closing tape measures.
Yeah, the myo tape, I send those to clients all the time. It's pretty damn good, even in the hands of someone who's never done it before. You can get pretty good with it real fast.
Yep. Yeah, and you're not alone. I know Andy Morgan's a big proponent of this. And basically what you do is you just get the myo tape and you measure your same circumferences like 3 times in a row, like right now, until you can get down to being within a pretty good amount of error. Like if you can get within a centimeter each time you measure on yourself, then that's something where you can go, okay, well, when would I expect a centimeter of change in a given metric? Or for those who are operating in the States, that's like a 1/4 inch-ish, right? Mm-hmm. So if I can get the same measurement within a 1/4 inch, okay, so when can I expect a 1/4 inch change? Now, okay, I can do this every 2 weeks. I can measure my waist. If I'm in a reasonably aggressive deficit, that probably is not an unrealistic expectation. And that type of thing is a great compliment because the scale measures everything. If you look at any good coaches like spreadsheets, they're typically calculating like a rolling average or every 2-week average or something from all the body weight weigh-ins, because the day-to-day scale fluctuation, I think people are really familiar with this. It can be all over the place. And that can be really psychologically stressful if you're not aware of what that means. And sometimes even if you are. So having these additional kind of assurances as to whether or not you're actually making progress or not can be really helpful. And trainers will often talk about this more subjectively all the time, but do your clothes fit differently? And so if you can sit there and go, my scale weight hasn't changed for 2 weeks, it's been bouncing all over the place, but my waist measurement's down and it's disproportionately down to other metrics, that's probably a good indication if you're losing the right things. And if you're also performing well in the gym, awesome. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So even though it might be great to go to a DEXA, and if Grant had more directly answered your question, he might have said a really good place, 3% error, going to a different place every time, 4, 5, 6, 7% error if you go in different conditions to 2 different machines with 2 different raters. And in that latter case, it's probably not even worth doing it even once annually. But I do agree with them. Every quarter, sure, something like that I think is very reasonable. And especially if you can do it in the same conditions with the same technician on the same equipment on the same site. If you've got like a local university, then yeah, you can get 4 annual DEXAs. I see no issue with that. And then you can think of a range that's probably, I don't know, plus or minus 3%. I think would be a reasonable assumption. It might not be. I think that's all good advice. But then you got to think, all right, if I'm only doing this every 4 months, like how long is my summer cut? 3 months? Like,
yeah. What are you trying to accomplish during the 4 months?
Exactly. And also, shouldn't you be able to tell something happened in 3 or 4 months on your own? So I think a lot of the times in practical settings, it does come back to performance, pictures, maybe tape measure, and potentially skin folds if you have access to someone who's very good, because that measurement is the only one that I'm aware of, although it doesn't spit out a body fat percentage, just getting the raw skin fold change, where you could do it as frequently as, say, monthly or even twice a month and know whether there was a real change or not, just based upon the data in the hands of a very good anthropometrist. So again, great for group-based stuff, but needs to be really attentively thought about when you're doing it for an individual change. Or it could not just be negligible, like I said, but actively harmful, misleading.
Yeah. And when I was doing my PhD, I ran one of the 400 level labs. So we had a body comp lab. So we come in and we'd have them do bod pod and all this stuff. So you get to operate the bod pod, then you get to see hundreds of students like ad nauseum. And then next quarter, you get to see hundreds more of them. And after a while, you get bored. So you're like, you play the game of let's guess this person's body fat, not in a negative or weird way. You just, because you're curious, right? You want to see, okay, how good can I get visually, because I can look at them. I've got the data. And again, there's some error with the data and do they follow what they're supposed to do? But what was fascinating is the numbers don't work out as clearly as what people think, right? Like you were saying, people have this thing of, oh, I hit 15%, I'm going to look this way, or I hit 10% or 20% or whatever. And I think they would be shocked if you had a way to measure like legit body fat percentages. And I guarantee you could show people look radically different at just 15%. They're all 15%. I've noticed, especially even more in females too, because just where you're storing fat will change quite a bit. Like we had a fair amount of athletes that would come in and we'd also play the game of trying to guess, both guys and females, like what sport did they play, right? Just watch the Olympics. Like you see very different forms as a result of what they're trying to perform for their sport. And so it was interesting to see people visually. You're like, wow, that person does look quite a bit leaner than that person. But the data was very different in some cases. So again, I think people, like you said, have this visual of where they think X percentage is. And I always try to have the conversation similar to you where, okay, let's just get a direction and then we'll just decide along the way, right? Instead of, oh, you have to be 17% or you have to be 13%, or because they're more going for a look. They're not going for a percentage. And I think I've had the inverse where I haven't had that conversation ahead of time and they get to whatever percentage it is and they're like, whoa, this isn't what I thought it would look like, or the reverse. So yeah, it's, again, can be useful, but again, what is it used for? Is it just curiosity, or are you trying to determine directionality, or you're trying to determine your end goal?
Said, totally agree.
Yeah. Well, I got a couple of minutes here real quick, and I just wanted to hit on, you published a very fascinating new study looking at the age-old question of how much surplus should you be in to gain lean body mass, which I know is a whole loaded question.
Yeah, and I should say it is in preprint, so we have not fully published it. But
you haven't? Okay.
But we just got our peer review back literally 2 days ago for Sports Medicine Open. And it wasn't rejected, so that's generally a good sign.
That's a good sign. That's a good sign.
Yeah, so we're working on addressing the comments, and we've got to resubmit by the beginning of October. So
nice.
Good chance we could see this published in press, not fully in print, by end of the year. So that's cool. Yeah, what we did, and this study took a long time. So shout out to Legion Athletics as well as Renaissance Periodization.
Yeah.
We were able to, Legion fully funded the study, and then the guys over at RP, Mike Israetel has always been very generous, as well as Nick Shaw. And we were able to pay dietitian Steve Taylor to manage each individual's stuff through the RP grant.
Which for a study like this is absolutely huge.
Yeah, it's very important.
If you're not 100%. Controlling calories, then why you want to study?
Yeah, like it's one of your independent or dependent variables you got to control for. So yeah, what we did is, and we started literally in 2019, but COVID delayed it massively, as we wanted to compare a very slight surplus to a more quote unquote kind of normal surplus to maintenance energy intake in trained lifters and see how they went after 8 weeks in terms of changes in both muscle mass, strength, and adipose tissue. So just like we've been talking about, we measured 8-site skin folds pre and post. We measured biceps, triceps, and quadriceps muscle thicknesses via ultrasound. And then we also measured changes in bench press and squat 1RM. The actual surplus sizes, the targets, which were actually based upon rates of body weight change, was a 5% surplus, a 15% surplus, or trying to roughly maintain weight. So everyone who enrolled in the study, we had them go through a weight stabilization phase, so that for at least 2 weeks we saw plus or minus 1% on their initial weight. And then they got enrolled, randomly assigned to one of these 3 groups. We were blinded to it, which group they were assigned, as the people who were training them. They came to the lab and trained with us 3 days per week. Only the participant and because they can't not know, and of course the dietitian who's running their diet knew which group they were in. And it was just based upon looking at their average body weight every couple of weeks and then making an adjustment, and then individual consultations with them to help them meet the requirements of the nutrition, which was at least 1.8 grams per kg of protein, at least 20% of calories from fat, at least 40% of calories from carbohydrates, and the rest, feel free. Hit these good thresholds. We clamped their supplement intake, so whatever their habitual supplement intake was, it had to stay there. And then the training protocol was a full body program 3 days per week, which is, I think, a limitation of the study, but it's the name of the game. So they came in and did squat and bench each day, and then they did back, shoulders, and biceps. And the bench and squat programs were basically squat or strength programs, but slightly higher reps because we're still trying to get hypertrophy out of them. But they were a little bit submaximal. We used percentage 1RM and RPE. So they trained from like a 6 to 8 RPE to 7 to 9 to like 8 to 10. So getting closer and closer to what they could handle at a given percentage, and going from like the mid 60s all the way up to the 80s, 90% of 1RM on the bench and squat. But then they just did 3 sets to failure on shoulders, delts, and arms on the days they came in with different exercises. So they trained hard, and everybody got stronger, which is a good sign. And there were mean increases in ultrasound muscle thicknesses. But the actual comparison between groups was such that we saw some unexpected findings. And when you look at the group-based group comparisons, there's 2 major issues. One, COVID kind of nuked our sample size. So we only ended up having 17 people finish. So there was like 6 in 2 groups and 5 in 1. And that was far less than our power calculation of what we thought was an appropriate amount to not get a false positive or false negative type 1 or type 2 errors. So post hoc, we decided, look, let's do something in addition to this. Another thing that you could tell from the group-based comparisons was the mean change in body mass was actually the same mean in the 5% and the 15% surplus group. So the practical ability of someone to follow a very small surplus or a moderate surplus, when you're only looking at 5 or 6 people, like I think with larger samples, we would have seen the disparity in those means grow. But if just because you gain the most weight doesn't necessarily mean you are always in the 15% surplus group.
Yeah.
So we had some people on maintenance who gained a little bit. We had some people in the 15% group only gained a little bit. We had some people in the 5% group who gained too much. So what we did was post hoc, we ran a regression analysis on everybody just based on body mass. So instead of the intended surplus, we basically ran a regression on the actual surplus that basic on change in body mass, which is now we have the power of the full 17-person sample.
Right.
This is something we can really hang our hat on, in my opinion. And it's getting closer to the experimental question of when you try to gain weight faster or slower, ipso facto, larger or smaller surplus, what happens? And this is where we had our highest confidence findings. So we used what's called a Bayesian analysis, which is distinct from the frequentist testing of null hypothesis testing. Bayesian, it tells you about probabilities, and it makes much more probabilistic statements rather than dichotomized based upon p less than 0.05, reject the null hypothesis, and then just report confidence interval. That's fine. What we did is what reported what's called Bayes factors. And they're interpreted pretty straightforward. A Bayes factor is just the probability that one thing happened more than another. So if we had a Bayes factor of, say, 10, that higher body mass gain was associated with higher gains in skin folds, that means it's 10 times more likely the more weight you gained to have an increase in skin fold than not, right? It's like an odds ratio, essentially. So anyway, our highest confidence findings by far were that body mass was positively and linearly associated with increase in 8-site skin folds. So the more weight you gained in our study, the more adipose tissue you gained. Unfortunately, there was no relationship between strength, tricep, or quadricep muscle thicknesses. And there was just a very weak, I want to say the Bayes factor was like 1 point something. I don't have it right in front of me, for biceps muscle thickness and weight gain. So interesting thing there is that when you think about the study protocol, the biceps actually got the most direct and indirect work. They were doing back and biceps every day. So if you add up the number of sets, they're the only group that kind of hit like what we consider like a more appropriate mean volume for hypertrophy if you count indirect and direct work in the same way that like the Schoenfeld meta-analysis did. So the muscle group that was only being trained to failure, so lat pull downs or rows to failure, and then bicep curls to failure, a variation of both of those every single day, right, was the only muscle group that seemed to respond slightly better to gaining more weight. But it was probably not worth it when you look at the meaningfulness of that change, the Bayes factor strength looking at the biceps versus the Bayes factor looking at the adipose tissue, or I should say the skin fold changes. So strength didn't seem to do better, and neither did muscle mass globally. But there might be a hint here that, hey, these are trained lifters. So the people who are in the study, they had to be squatting 1.5 times body weight and benching body weight for men. And then it was just downshifted from there 0.25 for women. So all the people in the study were reasonably well trained. Some of them were competitive physique athletes. Some of them were competitive powerlifters. Many of them were not. So it was a kind of a broad range of quote unquote trained people. And I would guess that most of them were training more than 3 times a week on their own before they started the study. So we trained them hard, and I doubt many of them were training squat and bench 3 times a week, nor were they training each one of these muscle groups in all cases 3 times a week. But if we were to think about what would be a more ecologically valid design, getting people to come in and train 4 or 5 days a week, or looking at what they were previously doing and assigning something relative to that, that might have increased the relationship between weight gain and muscle mass gains or strength gains if it had been a little more tailored in that way. But that's a hard thing to do. It's logistically challenging. You can't necessarily get people to come and travel to your lab and train with you in a similar way that they would train at home, with equipment availability, research assistant availability, and the need to pay research assistants when they come in. And
just the fear of people dropping out too. I'm in your study, I got to train in your lab, I got to commute. I just go live in my garage, bro.
100%. Exactly. Yeah. And like we were able to give them vouchers for gas, but it was a fixed amount. And some people were traveling 20, 30 minutes to come train us in the lab.
Significant.
And if they miss more than, I want to say, 2 scheduled sessions, then we had to exclude their data.
Yeah.
So that's a high probability when you have 4 or 5 times a week for 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
so anyway, the overall take home is that if we just strictly interpreted this as a scientists, in the context of training 3 times a week with a heterogeneous group of trained people over 8 weeks, the main thing that happens when you try to eat more is that you get fatter. So unfortunately,
the one thing I think that jumped out to me was that it's harder to maintain a fine amount of surplus than I think people realize. Right. And this makes sense. Like, you've worked with a lot of people. I've worked with a fair amount of people at this point in my life. And there's just, I remember talking to Ben House when I was down there in Costa Rica, and it never ceases to amaze me the amount of variability from one person to the next. Like the more you work with people, the more I'm just floored at the amount of variability on the extreme ends, right? Because both of us are working with very biased populations and etc. But in paper, you'll have, okay, this person, they should easily stay in a caloric surplus. So you add more calories, weight's not going up. What the hell? Add more calories, weight's not going up. And then you've got Bob over here, who on paper looks the same. Bob's in a caloric surplus week 2, and he's cool to go. And obviously there's a lot of factors. There's stuff with NEAT, Levine's study of overfeeding and hyper responders to that. Some people move around more, some people don't. And so I think that to me is what kind of jumped out to me of something that from the outside you think, oh, this is going to be a super easy thing. We've got a dietitian, they'll be in a caloric surplus the whole time. But that's far from an easy feat to achieve, especially when you're trying to get fine scale difference between groups.
Totally agree. So yeah, one practical take home from this might be, look, if you want to try to bulk, obviously you need to train hard and train a fair amount so that it doesn't just mostly become adipose tissue. But also, yes, while I would probably recommend slower rates of weight gain based upon this study, like gaining 0.5 to at most like 2% of your body weight per month, practically maybe a 5% surplus is just something that's too hard to follow. Like it'll turn into a 10% surplus sometimes anyway, or sometimes be maintenance. So it might make more sense just from like ease of prescription to go, okay, a 10% surplus is the small range. And then if you gain body fat too quickly, that's okay. We just have a pre-planned mini cut. So I think that's one possible interpretation. A more strict interpretation is, look, the maintenance group did just fine. So maybe you don't even need to try to be in the surplus and just focus on progressive overload, eating enough. And then maybe at some point in 6 months, you should be up a couple pounds. And I think both of those are valid, but we do need more data ultimately to really uncover that. And it's probably more important, like you said, on an individual basis, how well you respond rather than trying to make these group-based norms when we're talking about trained people, because trained can mean a lot of things.
Yeah, the longer I keep doing this, the more I keep thinking, I just keep looking at more of their performance than anything else. Obviously, I'm going to look at body weight, I'm going to look at circumference, I'm going to look at pictures, all that stuff. But to me, I just keep coming back to, if you are doing more volume, more intensity, more density in the gym, if your goal is even hypertrophy, and that's relatively standardized within whatever program you're using, unless your calories are just completely horrible and you're like way off the mark. Like if we think you're at least at maintenance or we're airing a little bit high, even if we're off a little bit, that just seems to autocorrect a lot of stuff. Because in advanced people, if they really are not hitting a caloric surplus, and I've seen them go into a deficit, their training normally just goes with it. Not all the time. There's people I find who can buffer that more often, but it seems like you'll see something in it, or they'll start walking less, or there's some, I don't know, I just find myself looking at the output indicators more than anything else on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis.
No, I totally agree.
Cool, man. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you for doing that study. That's super interesting. And yeah, it's one of those questions where we know what direction to go, but that's been the age-old debate as long as I can remember of, if you're going to bulk, like how much do? You got to eat a pound a week, and then you have people do that, and they're like, oh, but I'm too fat on the other side, and like all the debate in between. So it's cool to actually start to have some early data in that, which is awesome.
Yeah, we finally got a handful of studies now. Like we had just maybe 2 or 3 prior, and now actually Grant earlier, he did a similar study to this. And like, I think we're not far off where we're going to see probably someone meta-analyze all these and look at it together and give some decently powered recommendations. But I would say for now, yeah, probably if you're a novice, absolutely. And you're comfortable with gaining a little bit of body fat, you can gain as quickly as 2% of your body weight per month. But I think most people who are looking to go through a phase like this, it should probably be closer to 1% per month as a decent target rate of weight gain. And just be prepared that it still won't all be muscle.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the last point. I remember talking to Ben House about this too. I'm like, he just, for whatever reason, a natural athlete, it's almost impossible to take body fat to fuel your caloric excess. In theory, it makes sense. You have plenty of extra calories on your body, even a lean athlete, but the physiology just doesn't seem to work that way. There's just something magical about being in a caloric surplus for just the ability to train, to want to train, to do more volume, just to add more mass. It just, yeah, it just time and time again, that just appears to be true.
Yeah, man.
Awesome.
Well,
Where
dude,
can people
I
find?
appreciate you having me on for sure, man. I always good to talk to you.
Thank you. And where can people find more about you? I know you've got a website. You're way over in Kiwi land there. You've got some books.
That's right. Yeah. So probably best place if you're interested in like staying up to date with research would be massresearchreview.com, where we
which I
review
love.
stuff like
Huge
this.
fan of them.
Thank you. Much appreciated. If you're interested in coaching and courses for athletes and coaches on bodybuilding, drug-free bodybuilding specifically, that's 3dmusclejourney.com. If you want to read my thoughts about all this and my prescriptions and what my recommendations are on the books that I referred to earlier, those are the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which you can find on Amazon as well as on the website, muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. And then finally, if you want to listen to me talk on Reels or share cool podcasts I've done like this one or whatever, you can follow me both on Threads and Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
And you've got a podcast too you're on.
Iron Culture, the 3DMJ podcast. Man, I'm on a lot of podcasts. So
you're everywhere.
I love to be everywhere on the internet.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. I'd highly encourage everyone to check out your stuff. It's always good stuff. I learn everything. I read Mass every month and always learn new stuff from them. So it's all the other stuff is great too. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Huge thanks to Dr. Grant Tinsley and Dr. Eric Helms for being on the podcast. Really appreciate them taking their time out to do this. We have links and everything down to below for all of them. Make sure to check out all the great stuff they put out. Really appreciate them coming on here to clear up some of the confusion about especially DEXA scans and looking at better ways to measure body composition changes. And if you enjoyed this content and you want more content, go to miketnelson.com/podcast. And you can see all the podcasts I've been on, all of the older episodes here from the FlexDiet Podcast. And you can also get onto the exclusive newsletter. Just scroll down. There'll be a little box. You can enter your info there. And I will send you, hopefully, what I think is some infotainment, entertaining, and informational at the same time. So go to miketnelson.com/podcast. Thank you again for listening to this podcast. If you could hit subscribe and can leave us a review, all that stuff helps with the distribution of the podcast. And if there's someone you think that may enjoy this one, especially related to body composition and DEXA, please send it over to them. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. And we will talk to all of you next week.
Personally, I don't care for puppets much. I don't find them believable. I don't believe you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.